At dawn, when the fog lay thick over no man's land like a damp burial shroud, the rats came out first. Before the whistles blow, before the artillery woke the earth, before the men stirred in their muddy coffins of wood and sandbags, the rats ruled the trenches. They were everywhere, fat, slick, unafraid. They crawled over boots, gnawed at fingers, nested inside the hollow chests of dead men. Some were so large the soldiers swore they were part dog, part devil, eyes red as fresh wounds, bellies swollen with the meat of war. Private Samuel Whitaker first felt one on his face. He woke screaming, flailing wildly in the darkness of the trench dugout, his helmet flying off as his hand struck something warm and alive. The rat leapt away, vanishing into the shadows with a wet scurry. Around him, other men cursed and laughed nervously, pretending they hadn't suffered the same terror countless times before. "Get used to it, Yank," a British corporal muttered. "They were here before us. They'll be here after." It was 1916, the Somme sector of the Western Front, and the trenches were not merely fortifications, they were living, rotting ecosystems. Mud, blood, excrement, corpses, lice, and rats blended into one continuous nightmare that stretched from the North Sea to the Swiss border. Samuel Whitaker had been a farm boy from Iowa. He had grown up with animals, with dirt under his nails, with storms and slaughter and hard labor. He thought himself prepared for war. He was wrong. Nothing on God's green earth prepared a man for trench rats. The trenches were carved hastily into the French countryside, zigzagging scars filled with water and despair. When it rained, and it always rained, the trenches flooded, turning into open sewers. Men stood ankle-deep, sometimes knee-deep, in foul water for days. Trench foot set in, skin turning white and peeling, flesh rotting while still alive. And where there was rot, there were rats. The trenches were carved hastily into the French countryside, zigzagging scars filled with water and despair. When it rained, and it always rained, the trenches flooded, turning into open sewers. Men stood ankle-deep, sometimes knee-deep, in foul water for days. Trench foot set in, skin turning white and peeling, flesh rotting while still alive. And where there was rot, there were rats. They came at night mostly, though hunger made them bold even during daylight. They fed on discarded rations, on human waste, on the bodies of men left tangled in barbed wire just yards away. Sometimes they gnawed through sandbags. Sometimes they chewed through sleeping soldiers' ears. Samuel saw one dragging a severed hand along the duckboards, struggling like a grotesque parody of a laborer hauling cargo. Another time, he watched two rats fighting over a human eye. The older soldiers told him not to scream when it happened. Screaming drew attention, from officers, from enemies, from madness itself. Rats were not just disgusting, they were dangerous. They spread disease, trench fever, typhus, dysentery. Men scratched at lice bites until their skin bled, then infection set in. Fever followed, hallucinations, death, sometimes quietly, sometimes screaming. The irony was cruel. Armies spent millions on artillery and rifles, but it was the smallest creatures that claimed countless lives. Every morning after stand to, the men would try to kill as many rats as possible. They smashed them with shovels, stabbed them with bayonets, shot them when ammunition allowed. Dogs were brought in, terriers, trained rat catchers, but even they became overwhelmed. For every rat killed, 3 more seemed to crawl from the earth. One night, after a bombardment that lasted 6 hours, the rats came in a wave. The shelling had churned up no man's land, unearthing shallow graves and scattering body parts like broken dolls. When the guns fell silent, the rats surged forward, driven by hunger. They poured into the trenches in such numbers that men climbed onto fire steps and sandbags to escape them. Samuel remembered the sound most of all, the endless scratching, squealing, the wet tearing noises as they fed. The moonlight revealed a carpet of moving bodies. Some soldiers wept openly. Others laughed hysterically. A few simply stared, hollow-eyed, their minds slipping quietly into places they would never return from. That was the night Samuel learned that fear had layers. The enemy's bullets were terrifying, yes. The shells were worse. But the rats, persistent, intimate, unstoppable, broke something deeper. Weeks passed, months. The war ground on with mechanical indifference. Men learned to sleep through artillery, learned to step over corpses without looking, learned not to think about home too much because memory hurt more than hunger. But the rats never became normal. Samuel befriended a French soldier named Etienne, a former schoolteacher from Lyon. Etienne spoke softly, carried a small notebook where he wrote poems, and shared his wine whenever he could get it. One night, Etienne confessed something in a whisper. "Do you know," he said, "that sometimes I think the rats understand us better than our generals?" Samuel didn't answer. "They know this place is hell," Etienne continued. "They thrive in it. We pretend it is honor." 3 days later, Etienne was killed by a sniper while relieving himself behind a traverse. His body lay where it fell for 2 days, unreachable under fire. When they finally retrieved him, the rats had already claimed his face. Samuel vomited until there was nothing left inside him. By 1917, American troops began arriving in greater numbers, fresh-faced and confident. They joked about the trenches, about the British tea, about the rats. They stopped joking within a week. Veterans watched them with a mixture of pity and resentment. The trenches stripped everyone down eventually. One American lieutenant ordered a full rat extermination effort, poison, traps, organized hunts. It failed spectacularly. Poison killed some rats, but others ate the poisoned ones and survived. Traps caught a few dozen while thousands scurried past. The rats adapted faster than the men. There were rumors, stories whispered during night watches. Rats the size of cats, rats that attacked in groups, rats that climbed onto wounded men and began eating before they were dead. They scattered when Samuel shouted, leaving behind a body already half consumed. War erased uniforms quickly. By the time the armistice came in November 1918, millions were dead. The trenches were abandoned, slowly reclaimed by earth and grass. But the rats remained. Farmers returning to their fields found the ground honeycombed with tunnels. Bones surfaced after heavy rains, rusted helmets, rifles, teeth. Samuel Whitaker survived the war. He returned to Iowa thinner, quieter, older than his years. He married, had children, worked the land. But sometimes, at night, he woke screaming. His wife would find him standing in the dark, shaking, swearing he could hear scratching. Decades later, historians would argue about strategy, about generals and politics and borders redrawn. Museums would display uniforms and medals behind glass. Few spoke about the rats. Yet for the men who lived in the trenches, they were unforgettable, the true scavengers of the First World War, witnesses to humanity at its most broken. When Samuel died in 1972, his grandson found an old notebook among his belongings. Inside was a single sentence, written in a trembling hand. "The war was not fought only by men. It was shared with the creatures that fed on us while we were still alive." And somewhere beneath the quiet fields of France, the descendants of those trench rats still burrow through the soil, moving through history's bones, remembering a time when the world tore itself apart, and fed them well.